Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Which Mandela effect messed your head up the most? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. The one that always gets me is particular to my friends and I from when we were kids. There was a creek that ran under the street in the neighborhood, and we would sometimes hang out in the banks on either side of the road. There was this big rock that we would sit on all the time, except one day we were walking by and it wasn't a rock, it was a small tree, fully rooted in and established, and the rock was nowhere to be seen. Mind you, it was an extremely heavy boulder. We passed that spot all the time, and all of us remember that rock. We call it the shape-shifting rock. Fruit of the Loon cornucopia for sure. It was there, I remember distinctly, and no other brand has that specific cornucopia. I could probably even draw it from memory if I needed to. This one is a bit more personal to me, but growing up my mom and I always made an effort to go to the beach every Friday afternoon. When it got too dark to be in the water, we would make our way to the park that was right next to the beach. On some Fridays, we would just chill on one of the slides and look at the stars. One day I saw the light spinning around and I remember asking my mom what it was. She told me that it was a lighthouse and that it's used at night to stop ships from crashing into the shore. I remember this vividly because it was kind of like my gateway into hyper-fixating on sunken and shipwrecked ships. Years later, over a decade, so this was probably in the mid to late 2000s, I got back into lighthouses. I go online to see if this lighthouse that I saw was still in commission, and I can't find any traces of it. So I ask my mom, and apparently this conversation we had never took place according to her. I insist, and finally she's like, I don't know babes, I probably forgot. So I go looking deeper, and apparently there was never a lighthouse where I thought it was. To this day it F's me up, because I know what I saw. I know what we talked about. Okay, hear me out. First of all, in Brazil, you typically don't go to school. Middle school or high school doesn't matter for the whole day. You're in school either in the morning, usually 7:30 a.m. to noon, or in the afternoon, usually 1 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Every single person who was a kid in Brazil and was not in school in the mornings when 9/11 happened remember watching Dragon Ball Z and having it be interrupted for the breaking news of the attacks. And I mean everyone. It comes up every time someone asks, what were you doing when 9/11 happened? Except Dragon Ball Z wasn't on at the time. Someone checked the airing times and compared to the time when the attacks happened, definitely not on. Still, a whole generation of kids is 100% sure they were watching Dragon Ball Z when the news broke out. Edit. Wow, this blew up, etc, etc. Also, holy F, everyone's saying that this isn't real, and they edited the timetables after the fact. You sound like conspiracy theorists. Look up Occam's razor. This has been thoroughly discussed by Brazilians on the internet. It's not something new. Someone else said in this thread, the TV show that played Dragon Ball Z wasn't even aired on that day. The one I'm part of. My National Guard unit from the deserts of the American Southwest was in Afghanistan for the winter of 09 and 10. During that time, our hometown had one of the very rare snowfalls, rare enough that we all watched it on Armed Forces TV because it made national news. The Mandela effect? The records all show that snowfall was the winter of 08 and 09 when we were home, but none of us remember it happening while we were home. It happened during our deployment. Weird. This next story is pretty fascinating to me. What are your thoughts on it? I have no clue if this counts as a Mandela effect or not, but I remembered it due to one of the comments I read. When I was a kid, I moved into a town and I started to walk my dogs up near the field by my school. One day, about a year after moving, near the end of the school summer holidays, this father and daughter would be walking up to the field at the same time as me usually, so I got to know them quite well. They had moved there the month prior, and the daughter was going to be at the same school as me, just a year below me. I learned where they lived, and it even got to the point where they'd invite me into their back garden when I'm walking past their house whilst they are getting ready to leave for the park. This happened a few times a week for a couple months. One day, they didn't seem like they were coming out to the park, so I just went on ahead. Then, turns out, there was a hot air balloon in the park which was still getting ready to lift off by the time I had decided to leave the park. On the way back, I spot a man in the front garden going into their house, and I shout out to them that I'm a friend of the daughter, and I mentioned that there was a hot air balloon in the park if the daughter wanted to see it. The man tells me there's no one with daughter's name living at that address. Obviously, I get very confused, as I know for a fact that this is their house, as I remember being in this garden I was in. So then I say that I distinctly remember there being a father and a daughter in the house, and I say their names, and the man is very confused with me. He says that there was no one with those names that had lived or even visited at this address in his 40 years of living there, and says I must have mistaken his address for someone else's or something like that. I left after that extremely confused. I double-checked the house, and a couple days later, after it still being on my mind, I even, probably illegally, looked over the fence into the back garden to check it was the correct house. It was. I never saw the father and the daughter again, and I never saw any for sale signs or anything whenever I visited their house, so I was fairly certain they didn't move. I even checked with my school after if there was a student with the same name as the daughter in school, and they said no. Even now, 15 years later, I have distinct memories of walking with them and becoming friends with them. I don't remember their names anymore just because it's been a while, and I remember faces more than I do names. Whenever I pass by that house, I always get a strange feeling of knowing something that no one else seems to know. Interesting. This was a very confusing story to read, and I kept thinking of Night at the Roxbury half the time. So I actually grew up inside one of these. I spent my formative years at my parents' family-owned restaurant, Emilio's Pizza. My earliest memories are of learning how to fold a pizza box, stealing pineapple and pepperoni from the ingredients table, yes, sometimes at the same time, sorry everybody, and riding in the back of my dad's Toyota Celica on deliveries, where he promised to give my brother and I any tips he made if we could win the quiet game. Now, nobody in our family knew the original Emilio. The store had been in business for years before my parents bought the place when they were in their early 20s. They kept the name and the recipes and even some of the staff when they took over. Some of the old-timers claimed to remember a Mr. Emilio who would drift in and out to check up on the place. A few of our customers claimed to have been ordering from us since Emilio Vespucci, or was it Vespucci? It's been so long, who could know? Anyway, Emilio himself used to work the phones and take deliveries. It was subtle, it was minor, but it was always there. Emilio or Emilio? Just one letter, but also a whole extra syllable, much like Berenstein versus Bernstein. Probably just a trick of the memory, and yet we met people in this little town who were adamant that the name had been changed. We sponsored some local house league teams, baseball in the summer and hockey in the winter, and both the league conveyors resembled our store from before we owned it. The ball team even had an old photo from Emilio's Pizza Tigers in their office. The hockey league was happy to reestablish their relationship with the fine folks of Emilo's Pizza. Over the years, we would get calls or drop-ins from old customers who demanded to know why we changed the name. Most of them were like, I get it, Emilio sounds more Italian, but surely registering everything and changing all the signs was a pain in the ass, right? Why do it for something so small? The sign, this is what my father always came back to. The sign said Emilio. It wasn't exactly an old sign, but it was like that when we bought the place. A piece of printed acrylic that hung in front of neon lights wasn't something you changed on a whim. It was $3,000. And besides, it matched the official name on everything we'd bought. One day, a customer brought in a fridge magnet that said Emilo's. The one we gave out said Emilio. We were stunned. It had the same font and everything, and the damn thing had a date on it. Happy New Year's 1980. We bought the place in 88, 2 years before I was born. Sometime in that window, the name had been changed, and I'd been raised in a castle of lies. We changed the name, reverted back to Emilo's. We'd recently had a tiff with the yellow pages over a misprinted ad and won in court, so they owed us big. We switched the name, the sign, the magnets, even peeled the eye off the side of the cars. Sent out "You were right" flyers instead of our regular mailers, and started selling the Emilio Returns combo. We still wondered why this happened though. Was it really just the former owner wanted to sound more Italian? Well, one day in 2002, we got our answer when an old man came around and ordered a slice of cheese pizza. I was sitting up front playing Game Boy while he sat and ate. He remarked, "Good to see you're looking after the old place." My dad used to get this all the time, but over the last decade, he'd met just about all the former customers. Still, no old faces showed up from time to time. The man told me his brother used to own it. I asked if his brother was Joe, the man my parents bought the store from, and this guy chuckled. No, my brother Emile. Effing who? Emile? It took every ounce of discipline my 12-year-old self could muster to not run to the back of the store before the guy disappeared like the ghost he obviously was. But when I returned to the storefront with my father, the man was still there and very much still real, chewing his cheese pizza and squinting toward the ovens. After a brief talk, my dad says, Yeah, Emile ran it back in the 70s. Well, that was it then. This was a line to the goddamn source. We could finally find out what Emile named the place. Turns out we were mostly right. Emile, who was in fact Italian but not Vespucci or Vespucci, we have no clue where that came from, was always called Emilio, his older relatives. The guy explained to us that the Italian language itself was only truly standardized after the country took up technology like radio and later television in the mid-1900s, and some of his family from the old country never liked the idea of using Mussolini's spelling, so everybody sort of did shit differently. In fact, when this story took place, Italians was not even the official language of Italy. He's the only person I've ever heard say Mussolini's spelling, and to this day I haven't ruled out the possibility that he was a ghost, so consider everything he told me to be apocryphal at best. So anyway, Emilio was a nickname, and it's what he called his pizzeria, right up until 1982 when the acrylic company he'd contracted to make the sign botched the job and shipped him one that said Emilio's. Obviously, the manufacturer was embarrassed and offered Emil a chance. They could replace the sign with the correct one, or they could give him half his money back and install the botched one today for no additional charge. He took the bad sign and the refund, but left everything else the same, figuring his customers would find it funny, hence why all the old-timers remember it was strange, and he could just change it back later when the sign wore out. When he sold it to Joe, Joe started matching everything to the sign, hence the strange duality we inherited a few years later when he realized he wasn't cut out to work restaurant hours. We ran the place for another 6 years, till the restaurant hours caught up with us too. Mom was making more than enough selling software, and we sold it to my uncles to give Dad some well-deserved rest. He spent a few years retired and coached my hockey team before starting a renovation business when my brother and I went off to college. It was a good time. As for the restaurant, people talk less than they used to. I'm not complaining. I'd much rather scroll Reddit than make small talk with the guy at the counter. But from time to time, my uncle will still pass along a story of some old customers demanding to know why we got rid of the I. My mom doesn't have the best memory. I called her when I found out about this one and go, "Do you remember that movie when Sinbad was a genie?" Without missing a beat, she goes, "Yeah, Shazam, right? You guys watch that all the time." I said, "You're not confusing it with Kazam with Shaq, right?" She says, "No, you guys didn't like that one as much. You like the Sinbad one better." She was mind blown that it doesn't exist. I think she even looked through our VHS collection because she was like, "We definitely have that movie," but she never found it. Shame. Not me, but a few other folks. I'm an amateur astronomer, and the book in our astronomy club library that causes the most controversy is one about bright comets of the last few decades. A comet bright enough to see from the city happens about once a decade on average, and a lot of people saw one in the sky when they were kids or in their teens, and then years later they ask about it, and so the book comes out and they look through it and check the year and go, "That's not right," because they remember seeing the comet when they were in middle school, when in reality it was when they were in high school, or vice versa. I was responsible for Mandela affecting my whole family. There was a football player in a rival team that always did the same stupid celebration whenever he made a good play. We all hated it. One day, when we were complaining about it, I jokingly commented that he probably does that celebration as a last request for a poor sick kid or something, and we are the jerks. Well, anyway, years later, the celebration came up and my brother said, "Yeah, but I kinda get it since he's doing it for the sick kid." I was like, "Wait, what? There's no sick kid." Then every member of my family refuted my claim and they all remembered reading articles or seeing news segments explaining why he did the celebration, and for years they didn't hate on the celebration because of it. Some of them even remembered specific details, like what disease the kid was dying from or whatever. I blew all their minds when I made them look it up, and no such story existed. Honestly, not even the famous ones, more like shit in my town changing, small stuff, but infuriating. For example, near one of the shops where me and my brother would go for walks were these weird pillars, the small kind you'd put up to prevent cars from driving through. Well, there'd be days where they're not there, and no one I ask remembers them being there. Then there are days when they're there, and when I ask about them, I get the whole, they've always been there. It's one of the few MEs I've experienced in this town. I live in Atlanta, and a few years ago I went to the Greenbrier Mall, and for some reason I couldn't find the American cookie I always go to when I'm there. So after walking around looking for it, I was told by two different security that there was never an American cookie, even though I've been buying cookies there for years. So I go all the way to the West End Mall and find the cookie shop I was looking for. Assumed it was just a mix-up on my part, so a few days ago, I go back to visit the piercing booth at Greenbrier. Guess what was next to it? The American cookie. I'm not going to lie to you. I distinctly remember seeing the same thing on my father's tidy whities when I was a little kid. Did you? I heard of the Mandela effect years and years ago and acquainted myself with all the common ones, Nelson Mandela, Bernstein Bears, all that. This whole thing about Fruit of the Loom's cornucopia is what F's me up. Because these days, anywhere the Mandela effect is mentioned, this is one of the ones that comes up. It's mentioned as often as the bears, and yet, nobody was talking about the Fruit of the Loom cornucopia more than a year ago. Like, mentioning it in this context is now a new phenomenon. I came across people discussing the Mandela effect off and on for years, and not once before, like the last 6 months, did I ever see it mentioned. Am I experiencing Mandela effectception? And yes, I do remember the cornucopia, and you can't convince me it's always been spelled Berenstein. Yeah. What's interesting about the Mandela effect is that for most of us in here at Assume, we saw these things in our youth. Most of these, I'd imagine, we were between, 5 and 20-ish? I mean, when I'm a kindergartner reading Berenstein Bear books, I'm likely hearing Berenstein because that just seemed to be the way everyone pronounced it. Of course, I'm not paying attention to the spelling, and all the stuff like monocle on Monopoly guy, I think we associated the little rich old guy with having a monocle, so as kids it was just put in our heads. I think as adults now, we will see more of these pop up years down the line, and we'll get to see how it happens. For example, I just know in a decade or so, 25-year-olds will swear up and down Betty White was 100 when she died. That's because they're 15 now, and over time they'll just remember that she was almost 100, and their memory will gradually go, yeah, she was 100. I love all these things though. They're so fun, but also frustrating too, lol. Mine? I swear Bob Dole died back in 2009, but it was just last month.